Okay, we ready to go? Dave, your chance to respond.
Thanks again for this opportunity, Paul. This is just great, and I really appreciate the comments from the commentators. It's a great panel. I feel like it should be an Annie Hall moment where Marshall McLuhan comes in. You know nothing of my work, but at any rate, so this is the quote that all three have a problem with in various respects, whether or not any theory can do justice to all of our responsibility responses, or mine in particular. So we'll come back to this. And there's some other common critical themes. The thought has been expressed in multiple ways that the theoretical machinery that I'm putting forward is too cut and dried. They quibble then with the specific emotional analyses. So, for example, why should I take quality of regard to be the sole focus of what I call agential anger? Or what's the argument here, at any rate? And how could you defend against somebody who disagreed with this claim? And finally, the accounting for all we mean. Either I don't account for it all, or Strawson doesn't account for it all, or Strawsonians can't account for it all. So let me go through one at a time. Chris has several really interesting and insightful points. And so the first is how can I defend my categorization against alternative models, one of which he articulates that involve the attribution of actions to agents. And these are actions which incur liability to emotional reactions, but they don't focus necessarily on quality of will. So, for example, it's the guilt transgression model, maybe Oedipus. But at any rate, the angry response to somebody, get the hell out, or you've insulted them. You didn't talk about this in your comments, I think, so I'll just leave it out. The Artaic assessment isn't okay. I'll just leave that. I'll leave that aside. So I'm puzzled by the guilt transgression case, I must say, and so take that to be illustrated by the get the hell out of here response, the insulting response. In that kind of case, or in any kind of case where there's an intention to do something that the person has some kind of awareness is hurtful, then that intention was the product of a judgment about the worth of various kinds of reasons for and against, and that's just answerability. Or anytime I've truly insulted you, that means I haven't taken you sufficiently seriously. That's disregard. The Oedipus case is very complicated, but what was being attacked in this case? What was the target of the response in this case? Well, it was his character. And assessments of what counts as a good character may change over time, so there's some archaic aspect to the view, but nevertheless, I think it was a target of attributability responses. Just like, for example, what slights are can change over time. So it's not a slight for a housekeeper to look directly into the eyes of his or her employer anymore, but was certainly taken to be. In fact, I think this is a kind of response I want to give to Tamler's somewhat dazed version of Strawson as well. I mean, look, just give me, this is just a kind of throwing down a gauntlet. Give me a case of a Strawsonian reactive attitude that's not directed to one of character, judgment, or regard. If there's no such case, then why is articulating these categories into a general theory of responsibility? It's a theory, by the way, of our practices of responsibility and the conditions of fittingness to which we're committed. But why is theorizing about that a bad thing or a worrisome thing, especially if it can ground a more nuanced and careful treatment of the many marginal agents that live amongst us? A second comment from Chris. How is the threefold categorization grounded? Are we doing it through empirical psychology, phenomenology, normativity? I'm not sure why the answer, all three, isn't out of bounds. I mean, here's a breakdown of the argument. First, as I said, I want to try to generate an awareness of our ambivalence when it comes to the marginal, to responding to the marginal cases. That's a phenomenological resonance appeal. Although maybe if I weren't so lazy, I'd do some actual XFI on this, find out what people's actual responses are. Second, then, I want to try to articulate the wide range of emotional responsibility responses we, in fact, have. And it's a realization of the fact that we have so many emotional responses that comes out of consideration of the marginal cases. Some emotions feel appropriate, some don't. Now, this is just descriptive list compiling, but it's with the implicit challenge to give me a case that I've missed. I'm happy to incorporate anything that you think I've missed. Then I want to focus on the universal sentiments. And so this didn't come out clearly in my précis, but I think that when I talk about a sentimental pair, I'm talking about what used to be known in the psychological community as basic emotions. So these are universal, they're eruptive, they cut against judgment often. As opposed to all emotion, I don't want to say all emotions are non-cognitive. I mean, there are plenty of emotions that have propositional content. Resentment, I think, is a great example of this, that it doesn't count as resentment unless you've got some kind of judgment that I was wronged. But I don't think that's the case for the basic emotions, and I'm focused on the basic emotions because I want a kind of universal theory of human responsibility. And so, this is empirical psychology. It's drawing from work that people have done on the basic emotions and what their syndromes are. Also something I didn't mention, but what I think is absolutely crucial to an understanding of the basic emotions and sentimental pairs is that they are defined and differentiated in terms of their action tendencies. So these are affective action tendencies, basically. And so we can learn a lot by identifying what the different action tendencies are, especially with respect to fittingness. Then I want to note how they fall into these three categories. These three categories correspond to the three interpretations that people have given of the nature of will in the quality of will theory. That's just good old analytic philosophy. Then I try to work out the fittingness conditions of each, although I take the point that Tamler raised that this is somewhat underdeveloped. It's the most complicated part for sure. I tend to do this in the book by discussing examples, pressing intuitions, positing plausible options, and defending against counterexamples. That's just normative philosophy. But the question that Chris presses, why focus on quality of will in the first place? And the stated aim of the book is to develop as fully as possible a Strawsonian theory, one that accounts for all we mean, blah, 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 via a discussion of the internal norms of our practices. So I do this by starting with Strawson's own favored theory, despite what Tamler's Strawson says. By the end, the challenge, again, is to show me what important feature of our responsibility, emotional responses, that I've missed. And I don't think there's anything. And that itself is another argument for the Strawsonian quality of will approach, generally. So Chris then favors the normative interpretation of Strawson, according to which various excuses and exemptions are in part a function of ethical reasons and not mere emotional responses. So, for example, the guilt transgression model that he articulates lacks humanity, says Nussbaum. Or the austere, well, he didn't raise this issue, so I'll skip this. But notice in this case that Nussbaum's answer is, I think, unilluminating without appeal to the nature of our sentimental reactions. Nussbaum says that the guilt transgression model fails to look within the agent and so lacks humanity. But I think the lacking humanity quip is just a gloss on Strawson. I mean, doing so fails to engage with the other person in a way that's emotionally informed, and that's constitutive of our interpersonal relations with one another. Okay. Thank you. So, yeah, okay. I'll move on to the last point Chris makes. How can emotion pairs be true opposites if they lack propositional content and so don't have such logical relations? Again, I don't deny that some emotions have propositional content, but I'm definitely a non-cognitivist about the basic sentimental pairs that make up the core of the project. So admiration, disdain, regret, pride, anger, gratitude. These are emotions, again, they typically rise unbidden. They often challenge our evaluative judgments. But Chris asks, how could these pairs be opposites if they lack a belief about the objects they are appraising, which is necessary to establish that logical relationship. But I don't think a belief is necessary to establish their opposition. All that's necessary instead are opposing action tendencies. And these are elements of the sentimental pairs that really define them, as I was suggesting, as the emotions that they are. So my admiring you moves me to be more like you in this respect. My disdaining you involves my being moved to be less like you in this respect. Regret moves me to change my judgmental policies. Pride moves me to reaffirm them. Anger moves me to communicate the anger, which is a demand that you acknowledge that you didn't take me sufficiently seriously. Gratitude moves me to communicate my own acknowledgement that you took me more seriously than I had any right to expect. And these clearly tug us in opposite directions. Maybe he's worried about my use of the term opposite. If so, I happily substitute the term contraries. Tamler. So first, what comes out of the first point that comes out of the Strawson interview is that he never put forward a quality of will theory. His point instead was that grounds for excuses and exemptions come from facts about our natural reactions to one another and not from any theoretical conclusion about determinism. It's usually from our perception of their quality of will, but the real point was to reveal the wide-ranging, messy human practices we engage in, which can't be fruitfully theorized. This is great. So my own view is clearly Strawsonian. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether Strawson himself would have signed on. Nevertheless, we do have a love affair with Strawson that's competitive. So whether I got Strawson right really does matter to me. And so it's worth saying something in response here. Strawson says explicitly that the demand for regard or goodwill is reflected in our ordinary reactive attitudes. To the extent that we are talking about the entire range of reactive attitudes, that claim, which is a theoretical claim, is false. Yes, it matters a lot how people view us, what attitudes they have toward us, what their quality of regard is. But it also matters a lot to us what sorts of judgments people make, as well as what their character traits are, what they're like. Our responses to failures and successes to these other types of quality of will can be just like the responses we have to failures and successes in regard, in terms of their mattering to us, in terms of their force and feel, and in terms of how they may modify our relationships. Further, the different qualities of will implicate different agential capacities, which is what lots of people point to as the source of responsibility. So if we're really going to talk about all we mean when talking about responsibility, we have to go pluralist. So Tamler is going to be on board with that, but then why not go crazy? Why not go crazy pluralist and just admit that the practices are really messy? There's no way to offer a clean theory that groups our responses into a tidy package. I'm not Strawsonian enough, in other words. Here's a response. I've stumbled onto what I think is a tidy package. There are three, and only three, it seems to me, general categories to which our responsibility responses react: quality of character, quality of judgment, quality of regard. The challenge then, as I've said a few times, to Tamler or to Tamler's Strawson, is to show me what's missing. What other agential capacity could be implicated? I just can't envision what it would be. I'm not stating that there is no other possibility. I'm just saying I can't figure out what it might be. If there are others, I'd love to hear them. The point about children, I can go through fairly quickly. Tamler's objection was that Strawson talks about them a lot. He gives them a back and forth participant stance interpretation. So Watson and I can't appeal to children as a source of an objection to Strawson. I think the point of the objection as we're raising it isn't as Tamler construes it, which on Tamler's construal, while it seems inappropriate to feel resentment toward a young child, she may still express ill will. And Tamler's Strawson replies, it could be perfectly appropriate to feel resentment to a young child. I did to Galen and so forth. This ignores Strawson's nuanced discussion of the way we go back and forth with a participant stance with respect to children. Now, I absolutely agree. Strawson's discussion of children is really nice. It's a nuanced discussion. In some ways, it's a precursor to Bernard Williams' much later discussion of proleptic blame. of the ways in which we may appropriately blame a non-culpable individual in order to provide him with the reasons to do things that he previously lacked access to. Is what George Tsai, who's here, has also been working on as well. Now, I actually do think it's unfitting to resent a child, but that's neither here nor there. But at any rate, Watson's objection shouldn't be taken as an objection to how Strawson views children. Rather, it should be taken as an objection to Strawson's quality of will theory. For consider anyone who is, take anyone who's exempt, right? Start with that. So you could have a psychotic, you could have someone from poor circumstances, or a child, which is one of Strawson's own examples. These are just to be taken as by stipulation exempt agents for purposes of what's to follow. And Gary's point is those by stipulation exempt agents may still express good or ill will in a sense. That's how he puts it. But then, continues the objection, the capacity for quality of will can't be the exclusive condition of responsibility. That's Gary's objection. That's what I use with help from the marginal cases to then argue against any attempt to offer a monistic quality of will theory. It's going to have to be pluralist. All right, the Grady Little case. So he didn't have disregard for anyone in leaving Pedro Martinez in too long, but anger seems eminently fitting to him from the fans. Now, Tamler gives an alternate proposal here for the nature of fittingness, suggesting this. An agent's emotion is fitting if the emotion seems fitting to the agent after being informed of all the potentially relevant empirical facts. I think that kind of subjectivist proposal is just a non-starter. I mean, it doesn't allow for there to be any real standard of wrongness other than the responder's own sensibilities, and those sensibilities could be wacky. And I think that's just too permissive. But the case is nevertheless a really interesting case. Anger does seem, at least on the part of the rabid fan, fitting for Grady Little. I say anger is fitting for disregard, but there wasn't any disregard in this case. So what Tamler is putting his finger on here is something I wish I'd put more carefully in the book. The book as it stands does read as if I think that anger is fitting exclusively for poor quality of regard, for slights. I actually don't want to be committed to that view, and there's some wiggle room in some footnotes, but again, I didn't put this up front as I should have. I think anger could fit, in some cases, poor character or poor judgment. What I meant to be doing, however, was drawing from what I think are anger's most uncontroversial paradigm cases to discover the contours of accountability. And that's where anger fits most snugly, one might say. So Tamler's right to press me on this. That being said, I still think I can account for the case he raises, given the resources that I've already got, that I do have in the book, even on the exclusivist reading of anger's fittingness conditions. In the book, I distinguish between two types of anger: goal frustration anger and what I call agential anger. And goal frustration anger fittingly responds to, well, goal frustration. And that can come from a variety of non-agential sources. The avalanche gets in your way, comes down the road, blocks you from getting to work. You get angry, and that's perfectly fitting, whereas agential anger responds to slights. Now, this is not just some made-up arbitrary difference. I think there's a really nice psychologically informed way to differentiate those two, and it's in terms of their action tendencies. So my action tendency in coming across the avalanche is to get around it or get over it or get through it somehow, to remove the source of the blockage and to satisfy the goal that I have. Whereas the goal that I have with respect to another agent who slights me is going to be different. It's going to have to do with sometimes retaliation, sometimes just communication of the anger, as I think demanding acknowledgement of what you did to me. Okay. I think obviously the main action tendency of those who got angry at Grady Little was the goal frustration kind of anger. But there are some extreme, rabid fans, like Tamler, who might maintain that their anger had a different action tendency, which really was to get back at him or demand that he acknowledge his wrongdoing. Now, that's easy to do from the safety of being on the other side of the TV set. I'm guessing that Even these folks, when faced with Grady Little in the flesh, would do no such thing. And starstruck, they might raise a slight kerfuffle. Come on, you know you should have pulled him earlier. But my hunch is that most would be sheepish. And here's why. If they try to muster up their anger again, they'll realize that Grady Little did not slight them. He was just doing a poor managing job. And while it might have felt personal, it wasn't. Time to get over it. Move on. Finally, he says waffling between the objective attitude and resenting or being angry or contemptuous about the same person for the same action is a fact of life. So yeah, this is true. Just like we waffle sometimes between being amused about something and not, being afraid of something and not, being admiring of a work of art and not, and so on. But we also counsel one another on these things. We urge one another this way or that, saying that we're wrong or trying to give reasons for why we should move off of the particular response that we've got. The fact that disagreement is a fact of life isn't a reason to abandon our familiar strategies for resolving them or to articulate the basis for the reasons we are giving one another. And that's my project. Finally, Saul, who I don't have any bullet points on for the PowerPoint, but I just like the picture. He looks like he's got a kind of secret. Free will's an illusion is probably the secret that he's got. The first reviewer for the book, I can't remember what the journal was or anything, but said that Shoemaker doesn't engage with discussion of free will is utterly outrageous. You put it in much kinder terms. So there are two stages to the Strawsonian argument. One is to try to account for all we mean by looking at our practices and seeing, in fact, what kind of appropriate conditions govern them. And then the second is to give the argument for compatibilism, which is that no theoretical conclusion about determinism is going to affect one way or the other, or doesn't enter into one way or the other the conditions that render these kinds of responses apt. I don't do the second bit, and that's the enormously controversial part of Strawson. All I'm interested in is trying to do the first bit, which is to systematically go through and articulate the internal norms of our practices, in particular with respect to our emotional responses. So I'm agnostic, officially, about compatibilism versus incompatibilism. It's perfectly possible that it could go either way. And so when you ask, is it okay to keep living as we do, I don't address that question. Maybe the practices should go. Now, I share with Strawson, at the very least, an extreme skepticism that this is something within our human arsenal. But nevertheless, it may be that we've got to persist, despite the fact that we should be theoretical skeptics. It's possible. Nevertheless, I obviously have compatibilist leanings. So Saul is concerned with this kind of external war that we may have to wage, and talks about why we should care about the free will problem, and thinks about the past actions that I've performed, and could I have done anything differently? And these are pressing worries that we have about the living of our lives. What I do, when I do finally address the question of free will and desert and justice and guilt and condemnation at the very end of the book, because I haven't mentioned it before then, is to try to ameliorate the pressingness of that concern in a few ways. One is to try to figure out what desert could be about other than fittingness. And I can only make sense of desert if it's thought of in terms of fittingness. And because my project has been to discuss the emotional responses, and so I'm concerned then just with the fittingness of the emotional responses. So I'm happy to say that we can say that whether or not you do or don't deserve an emotion, but it's going to be a matter of whether or not that emotion is fitting. Now, because I'm focusing on the emotional responses as the bedrock responsibility responses, I think their attachment to harms is highly contingent and actually fairly rare, or at least not persistent enough to generate the kinds of worries that people have had about free will. I think that the worries about free will, they're connected up to worries about they connect up to the issue of moral responsibility, and then there's a worry about our treatment of others. We can treat them harshly, sanction them, imprison them, and so forth. But I think that all of these are practices that are built on top of a bedrock of emotional responses, and that what govern them are ethical norms. I don't think it's necessarily a matter of responsibility that these kinds of harsh treatments and sanctions and so forth are implicated by talk of responsibility. That's clearly true in the erratic realm. I can admire you, disdain you from afar. There's no necessary connection to any treatment of you. Same thing in the answerability realm. You might think that that's not the case, though, when it comes to accountability, that anger has this kind of communicative element. I got to get in your face, and maybe in so doing, there's some necessary harm attached. But I think in that case, that's false as well. There are plenty of cases in which anger is fitting and it's expressed in a certain kind of way that doesn't involve any harms at all. So when you come home late and drunk yet again, I just close the door in your face. I mean, there's clear anger there. And it's fitting, but there's no aim, certainly, to harm, and I don't think any harm is necessarily attached to it. But at any rate, so given that I think we can separate off these worries about sanctions and harsh treatments and punishment and so forth from the fundamental bedrock question of responsibility, then being able to do otherwise matters less. Now, it may not matter not at all for many people, but I think it matters less, and I think that's what motivates, it's those worries about the harsh treatment that motivate the worry that have attached to free will, being able to do otherwise, and so forth. Okay, maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
I go first. Well, thanks very much, Dave, for some excellent responses. So just very, very quickly, on the question of general methodology, I mean, I distinguish between empirical methodology of empirical psychology, kind of phenomenological and normative, and you said, well, why not just have all three? I mean, I think that could be fine. I just want some explanation of how that's possible. I mean, if you're dealing with basic emotions, and those basic emotions are like affect programs or something like that, you know, they're just kind of automatically triggered responses, then there can be a kind of ethics of that, I guess. You know, we can be glad that we tend to respond in certain ways. We can see that as contributing to our flourishing or something. But there are certain kinds of ethics that you can't do with those kinds of states, I suppose. So I don't know. It just depends how you're thinking about basic emotions. Also, conceptual analysis, insofar as you're engaged in conceptual analysis, you might think that conceptual analysis is not the way to go with basic emotions. You've just got to get out and look at the psychology and see how people behave. Okay, secondly, the question about the guilt transgression model and whether that's plausible. So here, I suppose I'm thinking, I've got in the back of my mind some stuff by Judith Jarvis Thomson. So I guess she thinks that the permissibility of an action and the worth of an agent can come apart. So she thinks there are cases where, you know, an evil agent can perform a permitted action. You know, in a case of evilly, you know, for evil reasons, killing someone who is liable to be killed because they were attacking another innocent person or something. So I suppose my case takes it the other way around, you know, and says, well, you know, you could have a perfectly virtuous agent performing an action that was impermissible in some way. And if you perform an impermissible action on her view, then you owe the person compensation or something like that. Or you may, you know, you may be liable to expectations of apology and so on. So there, you know, maybe you could insult a person unintentionally. You know, you could be perfectly virtuous, but nevertheless you do something that's kind of insulting, and then you owe them something. So is that a form of moral responsibility? I guess that's a counterexample to the quality of will case. The last point that I just want to address quickly is about your way of dealing with contradictory emotions. Now, so as I understood it, I mean, you want to say, well, look, they're just emotions that have different action tendencies. And I guess the way to go with that is to say, well, look, there's a problem of practical rationality, or a problem of practical irrationality. You're pulled two ways at once or something like that. You want to emulate this person, but also kind of reject them or something, and that's practically irrational or something. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting way to go. I don't know what to say about that entirely at the moment. I guess we've just got to look at the cases and think whether what we think is wrong with an agent who admires and disdains a person for exactly the same quality at exactly the same time without having revised their views is in a state of practical irrationality and not some kind of theoretical contradiction. Anyway, so yeah.
Good. Yeah. Take that. Just quickly on the second point, and the virtuous person who can insult someone.
Yes.
Kind of as a one-off. I mean, I want to thank you because I think that's a great example of something that I'd been looking for. But I think it shows that there are distinct types of responsibility at work here. That is to say, I mean, while this attitude doesn't necessarily reflect the person's virtuous disposition, nevertheless, it is a case of pure disregard, or it may combine with answerability to be just a poor quality of judgment case. But I think these are perfectly possible cases that fall within the domain of the tripartite theory, unless I'm missing.
Well, so I guess what I need to give you or convince you is that there can be a case which is not a case of disregard. Okay, the person
You don't think that that's a case of disregard when I insult you in that way?
It's meant to be a case where there's no attitude of disregard, but the person engages in behavior which, externally speaking, violates the other person's rights.
Right.
So they couldn't be more virtuous in terms of their attitudes of regard and so on. But nevertheless, they act in a way that is impermissible.
But there are reasons against doing what they're doing, because the reasons that they're going to, but the reasons against doing it are that they disrespect this person, right? And so they're failing to see certain reasons that are relevant to them. I don't think disregard is an attitude. I think it's primarily a perceptual state. And if you fail to recognize that there are reasons against insulting this person, that's going to count as disregard.
So maybe the way to focus it is just to say, can there be reasons that make an action impermissible that aren't reasons of regard?
That's a great way to put it. And that brings out an important thing that I haven't mentioned, which is, despite the fact I realized this maybe was a mistake early in the presentation, I called this, the motivating question was, are these marginal agents morally responsible? I am not interested in moral responsibility. I'm interested in responsibility generally. And so I don't think necessarily that the domains of moral wrongs maps cleanly onto the tripartite theory of responsibility. That's a fairly controversial position, though.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you for your response. If Strawson is our common God here, then, there's this discussion, who's the true prophet? Is it David, Tamler, or something? So I don't want to get into that competition, but I just want to, before I respond directly, I just want to say that there's a case for saying that illusionism, I think you can get to illusionism from any of the partial mistaken views, and you make a further step, then you can get there. And you can actually get there from the Strawsonian naturalism, Humean sort of naturalism. And if you want to see how I do it, there's a paper from Friel, From Nature to Illusion, in the Proceeding of the Aristotelian Society in 2000 something, I'm senile, so I don't remember what date. But you can, just Google it, and you can see I argue, and there's just one step. Because if you take Strawson's crucial mistake, we can argue about the motivism and all that, but the crucial mistake for Strawson is I think, because he lived a sheltered life in Oxford and he's fortunate, is really complacency. The idea that we can't change, that whatever happens in our beliefs and practices, etc., will remain. And once you see that that's a mistake, that actually there have been, and Tamler has done work here, and others, that things can be very different, and very different societies live and punish people and blame people and treat people harshly, emotionally, etc., without assuming free will, then you can see that arguably you see that from that follows that if we want to keep this common form of life intact, then we can't just trust our emotions. They won't do the work. We also need illusory beliefs. And that's in true or false, that's my argument here. Now, just in response, I think that a lot of what I do want to say is in defending the hard determinist perspective and the need to kind of try to live with it together and combine the insights of it with the valid and partial, but true compatible are related to insights are related to justice and to issues, and that's I think also part of our practical life. That's part of practice. That's part of reality. People care about injustice, and they care about collective punishment, for example, because it's unjust or things like that. So I think we do need to take that seriously. And there's a question how much we can take those things seriously once we are aware of the truth. But actually, I can say everything I want to say without thinking about justice and the defense of innocence and all that, but just focusing on the emotions and not thinking about harm at all. And I mean, just one way of connecting immediately to doing that is just thinking about the issue of value, of appreciation, of self-respect. I mean, do we appreciate what people have done for us or what we have done, our achievements in the past? And I think there's a clear distinction between things that are our natural qualities, like we just happen to be tall, or even we happen to be musical, or even to have a sense of humor, and our achievements and our attainments, and the things we actually feel that we deserve appreciation for because of our efforts, etc. And then the perspective which comes and says, yes, well, okay, yes, it looks like something it is something you've done, and it looks like something which manifests a good quality of will, etc., etc. But when we take the true view or the deep view or something like that, that's the danger, is that, well, that's just how you happen to be built. And, so some people are built like Mother Teresa, and some are built in less attractive ways. And there's nothing there that really, so our emotions, our natural tendencies, first of all, are then begin to seem out of place. Because, well, that's just the way you're built. That's just like complaining about the weather. And the hard determinist perspective would say, which again, I think is not the full truth, but I think there's a lot of strength there. And you can say this without thinking about harm. And also there's, I think, a very real danger that once people start thinking deeply about the free will problem and putting it in touch with their own emotions and their self-evaluations and evaluations of others, that appreciation of people, etc., will be harmed, and that we can't take seriously things that are part of our common practices before we knew about the free will problem. And just to conclude and quickly and to illustrate, I mean, my daughter, who's getting married soon. So, I mean, she's not young. She's not a child anymore. But I've taken care not to tell her not to look into my stuff, not to read my stuff. I mean, I'm happy for her to read my moral paradoxes and all those things, although some of these things are nasty as well. But I've tried to stop her, and so far successfully, as far as I know, from delving into the free will problem, because I think the free will problem is serious. And I know about a person who, there's a story about a guy who started to do a DPhil and PhD in philosophy on the free will problem, and then stopped because I know of somebody just saying it was so depressing. He was afraid he would kill himself. And that, I mean, if you're working on, I don't know, the nature of time or whatever most philosophers are working on, that sounds irrational. I mean, why kill yourself about a philosophical problem? But the free will problem is a serious threat. If some of you know, and it's half serious. I mean, I do have this warning at the beginning of my book, Free Will and Illusion, as some may know. So I think it's a serious problem. And the fact that it's a serious problem, it concerns issues of justice, and should we take innocence in traditional terms and commonsensically, seriously, and can we take our notions of our systems of justice to be just, etc. All these are concerned practices. Social practices are important ones. But I think I can say everything about the seriousness of the threat, and arguably about the need for illusion, the positive role of illusion, only by even if I concentrate only on emotional lives, on our appreciation and self-respect. Yep. So so there's a real worry here, I think.
So fair enough. You want to go ahead? Just go ahead. Or I mean, I can say something. Or okay.
Time is something that I'm getting
right.
pessimism about. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Saul.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, real quick on the children as a counterexample point. You're right, I may have mischaracterized slightly Watson's objection and maybe yours, but the main point I think still holds is that, and this was my main point, I guess, that this whole idea of coming up with a counterexample because it doesn't fit a very specific quality of will view is misguided if that's not what Strawson is defending in the first place. So that was the point about children that I would still want to hold. In terms of my fittingness definition, so you're right to call me out. That was too, it was too superficial, too careless. And while you're right that I would want to have a subjective, ultimately, definition of fittingness, it would need to be a lot more sophisticated. You need to build in something like it's not the heat of the moment, right? And yeah, there's plenty of room for discussion and plenty of room to be convinced that otherwise that your emotion isn't fitting. So I would want to admit all that and still say ultimately it's subjective. It has to be a result of whatever people resolve, and people will still disagree, and there will be no further thing to appeal to resolve that disagreement. On your waffling, it's similar kind of response where you said that we waffle, and that's true, that's a fact of life, but it's also a fact of life that we try to convince people which one's appropriate, which one's not, and we provide reasons, and we try to talk it through. And again, I just say that in the end, we might still disagree. I think that's absolutely the case, right? I mean, and that's also a fact of life, that after all this waffling and considering reasons and really trying to weigh pros and cons, like two people come up on different sides, and in the same country, for the same person even, never mind like cultural differences, which are significant, as people know that I believe. And then just as a response to your challenge, come up with a case that isn't covered by a quality of will account. I mean, there's a way in which quality of will can be interpreted, and all these categories can be interpreted to just cover all cases almost by definition. Like, if cases where it might be like historicity that we're responding to, but that's still quality of will because it implicates character or something, So, but here's one I think that actually, and it's something Strawson talks about, when you take the objective attitude because of the strains of human involvement, right? And so I think we do that a lot, right? And, we were talking about this with my wife and her father, right? Like, and he's not a marginal case, but there's, it's really open to question and shifts from moment to moment which attitude is fitting to take there, but it doesn't have to do with his quality of will. That's still, we pretty much know what that is. It's just a question of how much of a strain is it to feel resentful and how much isn't it, and I think that is something maybe that the quality of will theory doesn't capture.
Good, thanks. Thanks. Okay, I think we can open it up now to some questions, and I'll start off. Andreas will pass out the mic.
Here's a kind of case that it has seemed to me to be a case where somebody might be blameworthy for something where there doesn't seem to be any deficiency or objectionable quality of will. And some people have objected to that judgment about these cases. Some proponents of quality of will theories have objected precisely for that reason, that in these cases the agents aren't blameworthy. So they're cases of unwitting omissions. Yeah. So maybe suppose you're going to be away for a while, and I'm going to be in that town, and you say, hey, would you want to stay at my house? You could take care of my dog, and just be sure when you leave, turn off the gas, because otherwise bad things could happen. So I, pay proper attention, make myself notes, I have high regard for you and for your dog, but I overlook the notes. I forget to turn off the gas, blow up the house. Sorry about the dog. And another kind of case is, somebody's driving and thinking about something, just fails to see a stop sign, and then, smashes into another car and kills somebody. Isn't a careless person, these things happen. These seem to me cases where somebody could be to blame, blameworthy for unwitting wrongdoing, unwittingly failing to do something that they should have done. But they're not cases where somebody, they don't care as much as they ought to for other people. And it's precisely because there isn't, we can just stipulate there isn't any objectionable quality of will that some proponents of quality of will theories have said, yeah, not blameworthy.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, so, you're going to have to let me know what you think about the response about those kinds of cases from answerability theorists. So Angie Smith talks about cases that are like this, where failures to notice, forgettings, and so forth, which are a function of quality of judgment. That is to say that what judgment is supposed to be governing are the attitudes that would produce the intentions, in this case, to check the gas, and so the failure to do so is blameworthy on the grounds that it's a failure of quality of judgment. Now, do you not buy that?
When Angie talks about these cases, she takes the failure to notice or the failure to remember to be indicative of a lack of care.
Yeah.
And that's why she takes the agent to be blameworthy. But now I'm stipulating that inference would be wrong in these cases. So should we withdraw the judgment of the attribution of blame? Just if in the case where that inference would be mistaken.
So, I'm going to have sympathy with the people who are coming at it from the pure quality of will side then and saying it's not blameworthy, and to the extent that you think it is blameworthy, it's a tricky, interesting kind of case. I would be blaming this person. I'd be upset. And so to the extent that I'm going to think that that's fitting, the target of it has to be failure to monitor in a certain sort of way, failure to be governed by the judgments in a certain sort of way. And so I know you're stipulating that, but that's the kind of inference that I think I would make. And otherwise, to the extent that you really explained to me that there was, no. Judgment was operating as it ought to have operated. This did not issue from any objectionable quality of character, and failure of empathy here doesn't have anything to do with it. Then I got to say, I start to lose the feel for the blameworthiness. I know that's completely unsatisfactory. Thanks, Randy.
Just to add one thing to that. I don't think you even need to go to unwitting omissions. Just think about, overstaying a parking meter for a few minutes. You might do it because you're the sort of person who regularly does it. But that need not be the case.
Yeah.
You might think that it's okay to do it. But no, maybe the kid's still riding on the train in the shopping mall and, you just, it's bad, but you do it. And
I need to get clear on what the bad thing is that you're doing. You're overstaying
the parking meter.
What do you mean by that?
You put some
put it in,
coins
and
you're allowed to park, and then the coins expired, and you leave your car there. Yeah. So it's not a terribly bad thing to do. It would seem that you're responsible for it. And it would just be too much to try to infer from it anything deep about yourself, about your regard for others, about your character.
And your judgment?
Or even your judgment, because you thought, you knew it was bad. You were just tired, you didn't want to go to the car, go back. It's just but you knew it was bad.
Yeah. So your attitudes in that case weren't governed by your judgment about what you should or shouldn't do. I don't see that as an exception.
Okay. I'll just,
I mean, it's not morally bad by any means, and anger is certainly not going to be appropriate. But when you get the ticket, what might be appropriate is regret. I shouldn't have done that. I know I was tired. I shouldn't have left the car there. And so I need to change the way I engage in my policy making in the future. That's just targeting answerability for me.
okay, so I thought I misunderstood something, but
Okay.
I'll just.
Andreas, I'm making you have a workout session here. It's Robert.
Hi, thanks
Robert.
for all of this. This was super interesting. I want to take a second to address the Strawsonian civil war here and at least attempt to kind of reconcile the two of you. You know, us Strawson lovers, we all have to stick together. We should have as little disputes as possible. So I think here's a way of reading what Strawson is doing in Freedom and Resentment that is compatible with both of what you're doing, and then can hopefully limit the scope of your disagreements. So Strawson is a systematic philosopher. He has a systematic methodology that's a little bit anti-theoretical. But for instance, in analysis and metaphysics, he posits these two ways of doing analytic philosophy. One is rather reductionist, and the other is an attempt to elucidate the interconnected relations between necessary concepts and ideas and the natural facts of human life as we live them. And so I read the debate between the two of you as Tamler's complaint is something like this. The tripartite theory is reductionist in a way that's unlicensed by Strawson's overall picture. But what I would like to suggest is that the debate between the two of you should rather be read as a debate about what kinds of concepts, what kind of affective responses, and so on are needed in our practices, and what are the precise nature of their interconnections. So, Tamler, you think that there isn't going to be a very good systematic account of their interconnections, whereas Dave does. But that's not a debate about which, what's the correct, who's more Strawsonian, what's the correct reading of Strawson. This can all be accommodated within the framework. It could be that the facts of our lives require a tight interconnection in the tripartite theory, or they could not. And actually, same with your the objection about well, how would a quality of will theorist be able to explain, taking up the objective attitude when the strains are too much? This is just an internal question about well, what happens when? Because actually the case you gave is very interesting. It seems like you don't want to end relations with a family member. So sometimes when the strain of relationships is too much, you just end the relationship, and this is perfectly internal to equality of will theory. You bring up this interesting point about, well, what if we can't stop relating to someone? So long as there's Yeah, that's right. That might suggest something about quality of will. But the overall point I was trying to make was, I don't think the two of you have any deep disagreement about Strawson. What you're interested in is figuring out what precisely is necessary and needed to explain our practices, and you have a debate internal to that framework. I hope that's
if I can say, I think that we're in agreement on that point. Where we disagree is whether or not what's been done here is sufficient. I think that's the.
Well, no, that's one, but I would take our disagreement to be that I like your interpretation of Strawson, but I don't think Strawson himself was trying to, which Dave says he was, produce this pure quality of will theory, right. And nor, I don't think that was the point of Freedom and Resentment. I think what he would want instead is to say, look, these are the natural facts, that's ultimately going to decide it, and you're absolutely right. Maybe we will come up with something that just covers all of it. That's definitely consistent with, I think, what his project was. But what isn't is this particular quality of will theory is what I think will capture all of the facts, and I don't think he's trying to do that at all.
Well, and in a way, to be just a tiny bit concessive to you, which also pains me. The pure quality of will theory is a first pass at building up the tripartite theory, and it's one that one might draw very easily and naturally from reading Strawson. But I mean, there's part of his discussion about exemptions makes appeal not to quality of will, but certain abnormalities in being raised in a certain way and so forth. And so the question is, well, does he mean by that something that's talking about the capacity for quality of will, or is it something else? It's unclear, right? And so, so just read this as, one might think of this as a pure quality of will approach. Here's why it would be a problem.
Andres.
Oh,
Thanks.
no.
So the first point is a comment on this debate, and it's also a follow-up to Robert's question now. This debate about Strawson, to what extent is Strawsonianism anti-theorist? And so without engaging in exegetical civil wars here also, but it seems a bit strange to characterize him as an anti-theorist, and maybe an alternative suggestion worth considering would be to think of him as somebody who sees a tension between theoretical and practical considerations. So he doesn't say we shouldn't do theory at all. He says we shouldn't over-intellectualize. His problem with the optimist and the pessimist is not that they build theories. His problem is that the theories are incomplete and they don't take everything on board that they should. So, and maybe there is another kind of pessimism in Strawson which is worth looking at, which is that the tension between theory and practice can never be completely resolved. And this is a kind of pessimism that is perhaps also true of Williams. So this is just a comment. The other is a question to Dave, which is you're pluralist about types of responsibility. So my question is, why are you not a pluralist also with regard to the responses that are constitutive of the responsibility practice? Why do you give such a privileged role to emotions? Why couldn't we take on board other kinds of responses, the fittingness of which is crucial to the responsibility practice? And this, again, is something that Strawson might be willing to do, because in that quote that came up several times also, he talks not just about emotions, but also about judgments and maybe desires and preferences when he says about the kinds of responses that are relevant. So why not go pluralist here? Why give such a crucial ultimate role to emotions? That would be...
That's really interesting. Thank you. So I'm thinking of the remark that gets things going for Strawson as being that we shouldn't overlook how much we care about how other people view us, and that's an appeal to what I think are emotional dispositions, carings. That's what I think cares are. But I also think that we care about a variety of other features, agential features, but those are also emotional dispositions as well. So that's just an explanation for why I'm focusing on the emotions. But whether or not there are, by the way, as the kind of bedrock response, judgments, beliefs, desires. I mean, I think desires are typically implicated in emotions as well. But not necessarily beliefs or judgments. I would just have to hear more about what those options might be and whether or not they replace or would issue from some more fundamental emotion. I mean, it's a really intriguing suggestion. I just haven't thought about it. But so maybe if you have specific ideas, we can talk about it. I appreciate that. Thanks.
One last question, then we get to go out and enjoy the heat, or more heat. Joe. Good microphone, Joe, if you don't. Thanks.
I wonder if like going back to Randy's case, if you like switch it to like a, you know, a first person attitude, like a, you know, feeling guilty or something for doing something, whether your intuitions change. I mean, there are just countless cases. There's a man I know, you know, from the town that I'm living in now, who accidentally was backing out of his driveway and ran over his son and killed his son, actually, who's on a tricycle. And he was kind of in a rush, you know, and by all accounts, he was a very upstanding individual. And this was not part of his character. And it wrecked his life. I mean, I met this man, you know, well after it, and he was just a total mess, actually, and he died at a very early age, actually, because it, and there are, you know, hundreds of cases like this that happen every single day. And the idea that you can, like, go through and say, you know, the guilt's appropriate, inappropriate, appropriate, or something, just seems, I don't know, I find that a little hard to to believe. Does it have any, I mean, does Randy's point have any more impact if you change it to a first person?
I think it actually helps me. So if we were to change it to the first person and focus on the kinds of reactions I would have in that case where I left the gas on, I just feel I would feel horrible. I mean, I deeply regret having done what I did. But I think then what's the action tendency of that? It's to, you know, change my judgmental policies. That is to say, I should have done more with respect to monitoring the situation and so forth and so on. And that's to appeal to the governance of my judgment. So I think I'm much more comfortable in that case saying, that, okay, yeah, that reveals a kind of answerability. But I should also point out that you're exactly right. There are a wide range of emotions that we feel, and we're going around saying, that's fitting, that's not, that's fitting, that's not. That in and of itself doesn't counsel not feeling the thing in question. And so I guess maybe we'll just conclude on this note, the famous Williams case of the lorry driver who hits a child, kills it through no fault of his whatsoever, and is overwhelmingly regretting what he did, despite the fact that his judgmental policies were spot on. He did exactly what he should have done. We're going to counsel him against that. It's no fault. Wasn't your fault, right? But if he were to immediately stop feeling regret for that, there'd be something wrong with his character. So this is a case, I think, in which irrational regret actually speaks to a good quality of character. That if, in fact, he were to adhere to the reasons of fit not to feel regret, that he'd be a worse person than he was.
May I say like half a sentence on this?
Yeah,
Right.
half.
I mean, I think, just as you know, I've said so much about how the free will problem is a big danger, and we better not think about it, or at least not have the folk think about it so much, et cetera, et cetera. But I think actually in this point, in this sort of cases, I think that actually we should taking seriously the free will problem. I mean, this might be speculative, I don't know. But I mean, I would think that in therapy even, taking serious, I mean, believing in determinism and internalizing this might actually help. I mean, I don't mean that the person will ever be happy again in the same sort of way, et cetera, et cetera. But if you were kind of eating yourself, as there's an expression in Hebrew saying eating yourself, I mean, you're torturing yourself about what you did. I mean, internalizing determinism in this or different these sort of cases might actually do some good.
Dave, thank you for such an interesting book, and to all of you, thank you for such an interesting discussion, and to all of you for such an interesting time altogether. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.